The hush of the auction room did little to mask the disdain curling around the air like smoke. "We don't need worn-out women with dirt under their nails and empty pockets wasting our time," someone muttered, loud enough for those in the back row to catch the insult. But no one met the eyes of the woman who stood frozen by the entryway, clutching a notebook with calloused hands, her worn boots silent on the polished floor. Eleanor Harper, age 76, lifted her chin against the burn of humiliation. For a moment she didn't move. She had been to auctions before, many of them, in fact, but never like this one. Never where the stakes felt so rigged and the room so completely stacked against her kind. Yet, just 20 minutes later, every carefully drawn smug line on auctioneer Landon Burke's face unraveled when the convoy pulled into the parking lot. Black SUVs slicing through the early autumn light like dark promises. Uniformed state troopers, crisp in posture, swept into place beside the central vehicle. And when the back door opened, out stepped a woman whose bearing made the chatter die in an instant. Hair silver-streaked and pulled into a purposeful knot, eyes scanning the room with the assurance of someone used to standing where decisions are made. Governor Marisol Harper. Her voice, when she spoke, was deliberate, smooth as still water, but carrying a weight that left no doubt. "Before another acre of my mother's former family land is sold, we're going to have a conversation about how you conduct your business." The room froze, the pause so thick it seemed even the digital projectors faltered in their loop of parcel maps. Marisol didn't flinch when Burke tried to smile his way out of it. Governor Harper, of course. What a surprise. Please observe, we're in the midst of a premium sale. Premier properties for whom, Mr. Burke? The governor asked, gaze unblinking. For developers who won't read beyond a line on a title deed? Or for communities that have lived on this land for generations? Her eyes swept the room, stopping briefly on a rep from a development consortium flipping through a glossy packet. "I think we've forgotten what it means for something to be rooted." The Clearwater County Auction House, now renamed Burke Premier Holdings, stood on the edge of the repurposed mining town of Willow Creek, a town that had reinvented itself with faux rustic boutiques and espresso bars, while the fields just beyond town kept drying up under unfamiliar hands. The auction house was a red brick shell wrapped in a gleaming steel addition, a perfect metaphor for what was happening in places like Willow Creek, old values repackaged into something palatable for outside investors, while the soil and the people who knew it were quietly swept aside. Inside, the auction room was more gallery than marketplace. Spotlights illuminated clean lines of maps displayed on high-res screens. Behind a curved glass podium, Burke surveyed the attendees with theatrical charm. 61, tanned and sharp-suited, he prided himself on transforming a once humble rural auction into a theater of wealth. Gone were handshakes and coffee from a thermos. Now the deals were made over catered hors d'oeuvres and vintage wine. Each acre a performance, each bit a scene. "Today," Burke began, arms outstretched, "you'll have the opportunity to acquire the Ridgefield Basin Estate, 320 acres of prime agricultural land, ripe for development, boasting valuable water access and direct routes to the planned transit corridor." The initial bid, a staggering $3 million, didn't even cause a stir among the attendees, each one representing trusts and firms so large they had their own legal teams on standby. Eleanor Harper had entered quietly. She didn't belong to any firm, nor did she carry the slick portfolios others flipped open with manicured fingers. She wore a sun-faded blue shirt, her hair tucked into a braid like she always had it, and her boots scuffed from a morning spent walking fence lines. In her hands was a notebook, leather-bound, edges curled with age, containing decades of observation, regulation, and memory. She'd helped craft the very covenant she now feared was being ignored, a clause buried deep in the county records that protected the southeastern section of Ridgefield from development. She waited until Burke took a breath between parcels before raising her hand. Her voice didn't tremble. That southeast section has a water protection covenant, registered in '84 to preserve the basin's runoff and maintain agricultural use. You're selling something you can't legally convert. Burke blinked, then smiled a politician's smile. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but these properties have been cleared by legal teams twice over. I must ask you not to disrupt. Eleanor remained calm. It's not a disruption. It's information. There are 5 farms downstream from that section. Families who'll lose clean water if someone bulldozes the wrong swale. Burke stepped down from his podium. Miss Harper, is it? This is a private event for qualified bidders. Unless you're ready to make a $3 million offer, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I'm not here to bid, she said, holding up the notebook. I'm here to make sure you sell what you actually have rights to. The silence in the room was taut as a stretched wire. 2 security men in dark suits began to approach. We don't need interruptions from people clinging to old attachments, Burke said. This land belongs to those who can afford to buy it. Eleanor's reply was soft. Then I hope the buyers can afford the lawsuits too, because the land remembers, and that covenant, whether you acknowledge it or not, is still binding. Security escorted her to the door, but she didn't resist. Just paused for a moment to look over the crowd. The land remembers, she said again, even when people choose to forget. The door shut behind her with a quiet click. Burke turned back to his buyers. Apologies, everyone. Let's proceed with Parcel 4. Outside, Eleanor stood by her aging pickup truck, phone pressed to her ear. Mari, it's me. Sorry to call like this, but I need your help. They're selling the Ridgefield property, ignoring the watershed covenant. No, I'm fine. Just angry. The downstream farmers are going to lose everything if this goes through. Inside, Burke exhaled, pleased with the return to order. Next parcel includes the original homestead, 50 acres with structures that could be easily converted. Let's start at $2 million. In the parking lot, the low growl of engines interrupted Eleanor's call. She looked up. The convoy was arriving, sleek, black, official. Her heart lifted and clenched all at once. Oh, Marisol, she whispered, you didn't have to do this. The last words had barely left her mouth when the auction room's energy shifted once more. Through the large windows, every bidder turned to watch the vehicles arrive. The door opened, and in walked Governor Harper, flanked by her Attorney General and her staff, all bearing the look of people who weren't there to play nice. Burke tried to bluff his way through it, pushing forward with the next bid. But as Marisol stepped to the center of the room and addressed the crowd, the real auction began, the one for truth, for legacy, and for justice. And this time, Eleanor Harper wouldn't have to speak alone. The silence that followed Governor Harper's entrance held a different kind of weight. No longer the curated hush of privilege, but the kind that descends when authority enters a room, not asking, but expecting to be heard. Her heels echoed softly on the polished floor, the rhythm deliberate, as though reclaiming every step her mother had been denied earlier. She did not glance at the projector screens or the spread of maps behind the podium. Her attention was fixed instead on the rows of polished bidders, on the auctioneer now frozen halfway through his rehearsed pitch, and on the lingering trace of her mother's humiliation still hanging faintly in the air like the scent of ozone after a storm. Ladies and gentlemen, Marisol began, her voice as level as a plane at cruising altitude. "I apologize for the interruption, but there is a matter of public interest that demands immediate attention." A few murmurs stirred, not of protest but of uncertain anticipation. Her tone was not confrontational, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of someone unaccustomed to being dismissed. Landon Burke stepped forward from behind his gleaming podium, hands lifted in a placating gesture. "Governor Harper, I assure you we've complied with all legal requirements for disclosure. This event has overlooked a binding covenant filed in 1984, which prohibits non-agricultural development on parcels 2, 3, and 7 of the Ridgefield Basin estate," she interjected without raising her voice, and yet silencing him completely. Her attorney general, a tall woman with a lined brow and a folder under one arm, stepped beside her and opened it with crisp precision. "In accordance with state law," the attorney general added, "full disclosure of legal encumbrances is mandatory prior to property transfer. This covenant not only exists in the county archives, but has never been rescinded, amended, or legally bypassed." From the back of the room, one of the corporate bidders, previously poised with a bidder's paddle and confidence in the exclusive nature of the sale, stood, shifting uneasily. "Does this affect parcels already under consideration?" he asked, the veneer of investor detachment thinning. "I'm afraid it does," the Attorney General confirmed. "Any development plan violating the covenant's terms would be open to immediate injunction. Financial liabilities would be considerable." Burke tried to recover, to regain the air of control that had defined his entire career. "Governor, this must be a clerical error. Our legal team has handled dozens of auctions. If there was such a covenant—" "There is," Marisol replied coolly, lifting a small binder from her staffer's outstretched hands. "And it's registered under my mother's name, Eleanor Harper, who you had escorted from this room less than an hour ago." Burke blinked, then blinked again. The revelation struck the room with the quiet violence of truth cutting through assumption. Eleanor Harper, the woman in the worn boots and weather-stained jacket, the one he had brushed off as just another relic clinging to sentimental memories. She had drafted the covenant. She had lived the land, not studied it from legal abstracts. A hush rolled through the room, no longer silent from reverence but from discomfort, from the crackling realization that everything they had been bidding on had just shifted beneath their feet. Every deal inked in anticipation, every whispered promise of development upside. All of it now threaded through with complications no investor wanted to touch. "I must protest the way this is being handled," Burke said, attempting once more to regain composure. "Governor Harper, if you had simply reached out beforehand—" "My mother did," she said. "She tried to speak here today and was thrown out for it. Because she didn't wear a suit, because her hands are rough from digging in real dirt, because she doesn't speak in your version of value." There was no fire in her voice, only stone, worn smooth and unyielding. She turned her attention back to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, as governor of this state, I am placing a temporary freeze on the sale of these parcels pending a full investigation into prior auction practices and documentation. Buyers who have already placed bids are advised not to proceed with transfers until this matter is resolved. Any violation of these terms may be prosecuted under consumer protection and environmental law." The room, already unsettled, now teetered on the brink of disorder, not because of shouting or outrage, but because the carefully spun illusion had broken. Investors whispered into phones, legal teams pulled out laptops. The smooth choreography of Burke's auction was shattered, reduced now to individuals calculating risk and exposure. Outside, in the hallway, Eleanor Harper waited by a row of dusty brochures advertising opportunity in the new rural. She could hear her daughter's voice through the doors, even-toned and clear. Her fingers, wrapped around the notebook, trembled slightly, not from fear or age, but from the impossible mixture of pride and grief and anger. This wasn't what she had wanted. She had only intended to speak, to put truth into the room before it disappeared beneath polished platitudes. When the doors opened again and her daughter emerged, Eleanor looked up. "Mari," she said softly, "I didn't mean to start a fire." Marisol smiled. "No fire, Mama, just some long overdue light." They stood quietly for a moment. Behind them, Burke was trying, desperately, futilely, to salvage the tail end of the auction. But no one was listening anymore. 3 days later, Burke found himself not at a podium, but seated at a long government conference table under fluorescent lights far less flattering than the ones at his auction house. Across from him sat a panel of officials from the Department of Agriculture, the State Real Estate Commission, and the Environmental Compliance Bureau. No hors d'oeuvres here, no champagne flutes, just a glass of water and a notepad, which he hadn't touched. "Our preliminary audit," the lead investigator said, "reveals that 14 of the last 27 agricultural properties sold by Burke Holdings involved undeclared covenants, easements, or resource restrictions." Burke shifted in his chair, back straighter than necessary. "Oversights," he said quickly. "There was no intent to deceive. These documents can be buried, forgotten. It's not uncommon for—" The real estate commissioner cut in. "Which is exactly why diligence and transparency are required, especially when the buyers are often distant investment groups with no working knowledge of the local land." Burke said nothing. "Governor Harper has declined to pursue criminal charges at this time," the Attorney General said, her tone deliberately measured. "But a full reform of disclosure practices will be introduced statewide. You will be required to comply or risk losing your license." He nodded, not because he agreed, because he knew this was the better of two endings. That night, back in Willow Creek, Burke sat alone in his office. The ambient light from the auction gallery no longer felt glamorous, only cold. The chrome surfaces, the high-resolution maps, the designer furniture, none of it answered the ache in his gut. The clientele he once prized had stopped returning his calls. Too much risk now. Too much scrutiny. His assistant knocked, then hesitated. "You have a visitor," she said. "I wasn't sure if I should let her in." He stood, unsure why his hands were suddenly clammy. "Who?" "Mrs. Harper." The name landed with the weight of a river stone. He nodded once. Eleanor Harper stepped into his office, notebook in hand. She looked around with a kind of distant sadness, as if measuring what had been lost, not in his business but in the values that had allowed it to flourish. She sat without invitation, placing the notebook on the desk between them like a relic, or a weapon, or both. "I came to talk," she said simply. "Not accuse, not gloat, just talk." He studied her face for signs of triumph. There were none. "I know what you think of people like me," she continued, opening the notebook. "But I want you to understand something. This land, you don't own it. Not really, none of us do. We carry it for a while, then someone else does. But if we stop listening to what it's trying to tell us, well, we'll carry something else instead. Guilt, damage, loss we can't fix." Her fingers tapped the pages lightly. "You sell land, fine, but you can start selling it with truth." Burke looked at her, at the leather notebook, at the hand that had written out every seasonal stream, every dry year, every field that flooded first and last. He felt something shift, not collapse, but crack, a door opening maybe. "I'm listening," he said. and for the first time in a long while, he meant it. The morning air that drifted through Willow Creek the following week carried with it the soft scent of fallen leaves and freshly turned soil. Autumn in the valley had always brought with it a certain kind of clarity, the way light filtered through thinning branches, how the wind carved the truth out of even the most stubbornly held stories. And under that same pale sky, something new was taking root, not in the soil, not yet, but in the space between people who had once stood on opposite sides of a chasm and were beginning to look for a way across. Landon Burke arrived early that Monday, his suit exchanged for jeans stiff from unfamiliar wear, and a weatherproof jacket that still carried the faint creases of a recent purchase. He stood at the edge of the Ridgefield Basin property, its fields shrouded in morning mist, unsure if he was supposed to be waiting or already walking. Then he saw her, Eleanor Harper, already halfway down the slope, boots steady in the soft ground, notebook in one hand, a thermos in the other. "You're late," she said without turning, a wry note threading through her voice. Burke smiled despite himself. "I thought we said 9. Out here, 9 means boots on dirt by 8:30. She handed him the thermos without ceremony. Coffee, not the fancy kind. He took a sip and nearly choked on the strength. This could wake the dead. "Good," she said. "You're going to need it." They walked for nearly an hour. Eleanor led the way without maps or instruments, just memory and instinct. She stopped now and then to point out where water pooled during the spring thaw, where deer carved paths through the eastern brush, and where the soil darkened with years of composting leaves. Burke listened, not just to her voice but to the land beneath their feet. Each step unwound something inside him, a slow unraveling of assumptions and profit models, of developer expectations and sales scripts rehearsed to the syllable. "You see that grove?" she asked, gesturing to a cluster of cottonwoods. "There's a spring under there, deep one. Doesn't show up on the county's maps because it runs seasonal, but it feeds the aquifer beneath 5 properties downstream. If someone digs in the wrong spot, you lose that entire water flow. Takes decades to come back." He nodded slowly. "You've recorded all of this?" "More than 30 years' worth." She patted the notebook. "Not for fun, for need. You live on land this long, it stops being a backdrop. It becomes something you understand like a body. You learn its rhythms, its injuries, what it can tolerate, and what it can't." They reached a knoll that overlooked the southern basin. The view was startling. In the distance, the town shimmered behind a row of hills, but here it felt like a different world, untouched, humming quietly in the golden hush of mid-morning. "This is what I was trying to protect," Eleanor said after a long pause. "Not nostalgia. Not some idealized past, just balance. Just enough memory that we don't make the same mistakes over and over." Burke ran a hand through his hair, now damp from dew and exertion. "I used to think land was just opportunity. Potential waiting for the right buyer." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "And now?" He let out a breath, slow and uncertain. "Now it feels like something I owe a debt to." That afternoon, back in his office, Burke drafted the first framework for what he would call the Land Ethic Package. A new model of auction presentation that included not only title documents and parcel surveys, but stewardship reports and ecological observations contributed by local residents and longtime landowners. At first, the idea felt too idealistic, too unwieldy, but the conversation with Eleanor had shifted something foundational inside him, something he couldn't yet name, but couldn't ignore either. He brought in 2 more retired farmers, both women, both with lifetimes of knowledge and no remaining land of their own. Their names were Ruth Abassi and Helen McBride. Together, the three of them created layered profiles for each upcoming property listing. They mapped runoff patterns using memory and satellite overlays. They documented plant diversity and traced the history of seasonal shifts over decades. It was work that made the properties harder to sell in the beginning. Corporate buyers balked at the complexity, the constraints, the sense of responsibility implied in every page. But then something surprising happened. A different kind of buyer began showing up. Not the fast money investors or speculators looking to flip plots for instant gain, but people who asked questions about soil health and regenerative agriculture. Young farmers with degrees in environmental science and boots still caked from their last field internship. Community co-ops, sustainable land trusts, even food sovereignty collectives from neighboring states. These were people not only willing to pay fair value, but willing to pay more, in exchange for continuity, for trust, for transparency. By spring, Burke's office had taken on a new rhythm. The screens still displayed maps, but now they glowed with overlays showing watershed flow and biodiversity zones. The staff, once trained in quick closes and aggressive pitches, now met weekly with consultants like Eleanor, Ruth, and Helen to understand the stories that came with each acre. It slowed the process, sometimes maddeningly. But Burke began to notice something he hadn't seen in years: pride. Pride not in the sale, but in what the sale preserved. Then came the Ridgefield re-auction. 6 months after Eleanor had been publicly ejected from the original event, she sat near the front of a very different room. The auction had returned, yes, but not as it was. Oh, gone were the velvet ropes and catered hors d'oeuvres. In their place were folding chairs filled with local families, conservation reps, water board officials, and young growers eager to understand the lay of the land. Eleanor sat with Ruth and Helen beside a booth labeled Land Knowledge Panel, where they answered questions about soil conditions and flood risks with the ease of lived experience. Before the auction began, Burke stepped to the podium. No longer a sleek stage, but a simple table with a modest mic. He looked out over the crowd, and for the first time, he wasn't performing. He was participating. "I want to thank all of you for being here," he began. "Today, we're auctioning the Ridgefield Basin parcels. But this isn't the same auction we tried to hold last fall. That one failed, not because of a covenant, but because of a mindset. Mine." A few heads tilted, surprised by the candidness. "I used to think the only value that mattered was market value," Burke continued. "But there's another kind of value, one you can't print in a brochure. One that lives in the soil, in the water, in the memory of people who've walked this land longer than some of us have lived. This time, you'll find environmental assessments in the bid packets, yes, but also observations from women like Eleanor Harper, who have spent their lives understanding this place. I encourage every bidder here to speak with them before placing an offer." The first parcel sold to a sustainable farming collective. The second to a regenerative agriculture training center. By the time Parcel 7 was called, a piece of land once expected to yield the highest development return, it was instead purchased by a coalition planning a demonstration farm focused on climate-adaptive crops. Eleanor watched from her seat. Her notebook closed in her lap. Not because she had finished adding to it, but because, for the first time in years, it felt like someone else was finally reading it too. The weeks following the reimagined Ridgefield auction felt like a different season entirely, though the calendar had not yet turned. There was a softness in the air, a subtle shift in the way people carried themselves through town, less hurried, more grounded. It was in the way farmers lingered at the co-op to exchange notes on soil health, in the steady rhythm of boots brushing gravel outside the Land Knowledge Center, where once only quick steps and cold transactions had taken place. It was in the laughter echoing from the newly cleared greenhouse on the North Ridge, now operated by a youth agriculture program Eleanor had helped design with Ruth and Helen. Landon Burke began spending more time in the field than behind a desk, trading polished wingtips for the same stiff boots he'd worn to his first walk with Eleanor. They still pinched his feet, but they also reminded him in every step of how much further he'd come than he once believed possible. He no longer saw himself as a man who sold land. He was something else now. A broker, yes, but of continuity, of care, of a future that didn't erase the past to build over it, but let both live side by side. And that shift wasn't just local. News of the Ridgefield transformation had spread. It started as a column in a state agriculture journal, then a spot on a rural affairs podcast, and finally an invitation: the National Agricultural Stewardship Summit. Burke and Eleanor were both named to the keynote panel, though Eleanor had only agreed on the condition that she didn't have to speak on a stage. "I'll be there," she told Marisol, "but I'm not wearing a microphone. I've said what I needed to say, and now I'm watching what others do with it." Governor Harper, still carrying herself with that quiet, commanding steadiness, had taken the opportunity of Ridgefield's success to craft something more lasting: a legislative blueprint, the Harper Stewardship Framework. A policy initiative grounded in the very principles her mother and the other farmers had long held close: mandatory disclosure of watershed covenants, incentives for regenerative practices, and a public archive for local land knowledge. It was a blueprint that didn't just work on paper. It worked in real life because it had been lived before it was written. Back in Willow Creek, the Land Knowledge Center continued its transformation. Once a sterile conference room used to pitch parcels to developers, it had become a vibrant space of exchange. High school students sat in on talks about floodplain mapping. Retired farmers hosted Saturday morning sessions on weather prediction using cloud patterns and animal behavior. A local artist had painted a mural along the outer wall, an interwoven image of fields, women's hands, water, and sunlight, with the words, "The land remembers, so do we." One morning, as winter threatened with the first hard frost, Burke met with Eleanor in the old grain elevator office they'd converted into a records room. He brought with him something new: a ledger book, untouched, thick with blank pages. "I want you to help me start this," he said, placing the book gently between them. "Not a sales ledger, not maps or deeds. A chronicle." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Of what?" "Of the land," Burke replied. "Its voice, its memory, things we lose when it gets handed off without thought." She studied the book as though it might bite, then slowly reached out and flipped open the first page. The paper was heavy, substantial, the kind meant to carry more than words. She didn't write anything just then, but she didn't close it either. The following spring, the town held its first annual land memory gathering, an event dreamed up by a group of students who had taken part in Eleanor's winter seminar. Farmers of all ages, along with historians, ecologists, and new residents hoping to find their own footing in Willow Creek, gathered in the town square. They told stories, not just of hardship and harvests, but of lineage and legacy. They shared seeds. They swapped notes on tree rings and weather anomalies, passed down like family recipes. And when the sun dipped below the ridgeline, Eleanor stepped up to the simple wooden stage. Not as a speaker, but as a presence. She held the ledger Burke had brought her months ago. Its pages were no longer blank. She didn't read from it. She didn't need to. Instead, she opened it and placed it on a small table, inviting anyone to add what they knew. "This is ours now," she said simply. "Yours, mine." the lands. The townsfolk came forward, one by one. They wrote in ink and pencil, sketched drainage paths, and marked locations of fox dens. They documented bloom patterns and frost dates from memory. Over time, the ledger grew fat with careful entries, a living document of symbiosis. By year's end, Willow Creek had been named a model stewardship community. The Harper framework was being adopted by 2 neighboring states, and Eleanor, who had spent most of her life being called an old woman in overalls with nothing left to offer, found herself mentoring a group of graduate researchers working on a thesis titled Generational Land Literacy in Decentralized Rural Economies. But all of that attention, she bore it with reluctance. For Eleanor, the victory had never been about the accolades. It had always been about the fields, the hills, the way the soil smelled when spring cracked open the frost. The kids who now walked that soil with notebooks instead of phones. The farmers who planted cover crops not because someone told them to, but because they'd learned, finally, to listen. On the anniversary of the Ridgefield auction, Governor Harper returned to Willow Creek, not for press or celebration, but to walk the land with her mother. They moved slowly along the eastern edge of the basin, boots sinking into softened dirt, each step an echo of conversations past. "You really changed the way this town breathes," Marisol said, voice low. "I didn't change anything," Eleanor replied. "I just reminded people what they already knew." They stopped at the edge of the cottonwood grove. The spring bubbled faintly beneath the trees, its water crystal clear, still feeding 5 downstream farms that now cooperated in managing the watershed. A sign had been placed nearby, hand-carved by a local carpenter. Protected watershed, shared resource, stewarded by the Willow Creek community. Marisol looked at it for a long time. "Do you think the land forgives us?" she asked softly. Eleanor's face was quiet for a beat before she replied, "It doesn't need to forgive. It just needs to be seen, tended, like anything alive." Later that evening, Burke hosted a small dinner in the restored barn at the southern edge of Ridgefield. The tables were simple, set with local produce and bottles of apple cider. No fanfare, no speeches, just people eating and talking beneath warm string lights. Near the end of the meal, he rose from his seat, cleared his throat, and held up a worn leather notebook. Not the ledger. Eleanor's. "She gave me this last week," he said. "I told her I hadn't earned the right to keep it." He looked around the room, at Ruth and Helen, at Marisol and the young farmers gathered around her, at Eleanor, quiet in the corner, content just to be there. But she said something that stuck with me. She said it's not about earning anything. It's about remembering, listening, carrying it forward. He placed the notebook gently on a small pedestal beside the barn's entryway, beneath a framed photograph of the basin in springtime bloom. So here it stays, for all of us, so we don't forget. And for the rest of that night, people walked past it like pilgrims passing a shrine, not to worship, but to witness, to remember, to feel, even for a moment, what it meant to be part of something living. 25 years passed like the slow turning of seasons, not abrupt, not with fanfare, but steady, consistent. The kind of change that's almost imperceptible until you look up one morning and realize the entire landscape has transformed. Not just the fields or the skyline, but the way people speak, the values they carry, the paths they choose to walk. Willow Creek was no longer a town on the brink of quiet erosion. It had become something else entirely, a place where memory and progress walked side by side. The land told the story better than anyone. Where once the Ridgefield Basin stood as a battleground between speculation and stewardship, it now flourished as a mosaic of purpose, native grasses returned to long-forgotten slopes, cover crops rotated through careful seasonal maps, and the southeastern quadrant, once nearly flattened for retail development, had been officially named the Eleanor Harper Watershed Preserve. A wooden sign at its entrance, smoothed by wind and time, bore the words she once murmured under her breath when no one listened: "The land remembers." On a gentle autumn morning, long shadows stretching across the preserved basin, a crowd gathered once more, not for auction, not for protest, but for dedication. The Eleanor Harper Memorial Center opened its doors that day, built on the grounds of the old Ridgefield Homestead barn. Now restored and expanded, the center served as a living library of land knowledge, a training site for sustainable farming, and a place where local schoolchildren planted heritage seeds each spring, carefully labeled with the names of the women and families who had once nurtured them. Inside, the centerpiece was a modest glass case. It didn't shine or sparkle, it didn't require guards or velvet ropes, but people gathered around it just the same. Inside, resting open to a carefully marked page, was Eleanor's original leather notebook, the one that had been clutched in calloused hands, weathered by sun and memory, the same one that had sparked a revolution in values the day she was escorted from a room by men who thought they knew better. The page on display held a sketch of the watershed, annotated in Eleanor's spare, looping hand. At the bottom, in faded blue ink, it read, "Stewardship means remembering that the land outlives us. But how we treat it determines what it remembers." Ruth and Helen were both there, older now, slower to rise from their chairs, but still sharp as the edge of a spade. They sat near the front row, dressed not for occasion, but for purpose. Layered flannel and sensible boots, the kind that had walked more land than any GPS ever would. And Burke was there too, though his hair had long gone to silver, and his gait betrayed the stiffness of old knees. He no longer led the auctions. His granddaughter, Mara Burke, had taken over the firm, now called Burke Harper Land Services, a quiet nod to the lineage of change he'd once resisted. Mara stood at the back of the center with a group of young agents in training, talking about soil porosity and deed restrictions with the same fluency once reserved for per-acre returns. Governor Marisol Harper, now long retired from public office, sat with a quiet smile as she watched her mother's story live on, not in textbooks or press releases, but in the soil and the people. She hadn't made a speech that day. She'd done enough of that over the years. Today, she listened. The current State Secretary of Agriculture, a tall woman with dark braids and sturdy hands, approached the podium when the time came. She introduced the center with warmth and respect, then paused to gesture toward the watershed behind her. "This preserve," she said, "is not a museum. It's a promise that will honor the people who understood this land before we did, and that will prepare the next generation to carry that understanding forward." Her words hung in the air for a moment, not solemn but resonant. A kind of stillness settled, the same stillness that came right before spring broke through frost. And then, from the edge of the gathered crowd, a young girl stepped forward, maybe 10 or 11, notebook clutched to her chest. "I wrote something," she said, voice soft but clear. "Can I read it?" The secretary stepped aside. The girl unfolded a paper and began. "My name is Lily, and I live on one of the farms downstream from here. My grandmother says the land used to be scared, that it didn't know who would take care of it. But now it's calm again. Now it grows things that weren't growing before. Sometimes I walk the edge of the field and I talk to it, and I think, maybe it's starting to talk back." There was a pause. Then applause. Not wild, not loud, but steady. Real. The kind that starts in your chest before it reaches your hands. After the ceremony, people wandered through the center's halls. They examined soil samples labeled by generation. They sat through video interviews with farmers, ecologists, and historians. They read passages from Eleanor's notes, etched into wood panels, woven into textiles, engraved onto the edge of benches built by local carpenters. Outside, Burke found himself standing near the same cottonwoods he'd once ignored. The spring beneath them still flowed, though slower now with the dry spell, and he thought of all the times he'd mistaken silence for emptiness, all the years he'd considered land only in the language of numbers. He was joined a moment later by Marisol, who stood beside him with her arms folded, watching a group of teenagers sketching the basin from the overlook. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "We thought we were saving the land, but it's always been saving us." Burke smiled, faint and tired and full of something deeper than nostalgia. "Took me too long to see it." She nodded. "But once you did, you changed more than most people ever do." They stood together, watching Lily and her classmates trace the ridgeline with pencil and observation. When it was time to leave, Burke took one last slow walk through the center. He stopped by the notebook display, rested his fingers gently on the glass. Inside, a new note had been added, just beneath Eleanor's final entries. It was in Mara's handwriting. "We are stewards, not owners. We are listeners, not rulers. We are part of the land's story, not its end." Outside, as the sun slipped low and gold across the basin, a breeze moved through the fields like breath. And if you stood quietly enough, you could almost hear the land respond, not in words, but in memory, in the rustle of leaves, in the curve of water, in the echo of a woman who once stood in a room full of suits and dared to speak for what couldn't speak for itself. The land remembers, and now so do we.